Welcome to a journey into the origins of thought, where we will explore the minds that shape the very foundations of our understanding. Hello, my name is Mike, and I am the host of Mind Escape Podcast. I am happy to share my new series called Masters of Rhetoric. Masters of Rhetoric is a free course/podcast. The goal is to draw from the earliest philosophers, scientists, and critical thinkers to help navigate the current technological paradigm. In a world where divisive and heuristic rhetoric often dominate online spaces, I believe it's crucial to return to the roots of dialectic. This approach can offer the thoughtful discourse that humanity desperately needs today. So join us on this philosophical adventure by subscribing to our channel and podcast. Engage with us through your comments and critiques. We're excited to hear your thoughts. Let's embark on this journey together with Masters of Rhetoric. Enjoy the series. Before we dive into today's discussion, I want to remind listeners that episodes 1 through 4 of Masters of Rhetoric lay the foundation for understanding the history and key terminology of classical philosophy. We explored the origins of rhetoric, the influence of the pre-Socratics, and the fundamental ideas that shaped Socratic dialogue, Aristotelian logic, and beyond. If you are new to this series or need a refresher, I highly recommend going back and checking those out. Now, with that groundwork in place, let's continue our journey into the art of rhetoric and philosophy. Masters of Rhetoric, episode number 5, Plato and the Sophists. Socrates lived between 470 and 399 BC. He was a classical Greek philosopher from Athens, a founder of Western philosophy, and was credited with being the first moral philosopher of Western ethical thought. He did not write or record any of his teachings or philosophies, but his students Plato and Xenophon did write his philosophies and teachings along with some other contemporaries. Plato's dialogues are the most comprehensive accounts of Socrates' teachings and philosophies, which highlight his contributions to ethics and epistemology. Socrates used Socratic irony to confuse adversaries in dialogues and debates. He also used the Socratic method, which would lead adversaries and his students to critically think and ultimately to conclusions that would contradict their initial position and help further their knowledge. He was falsely accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and was executed by way of poison, which was hemlock. Xenophon wrote that Socrates was a teleologist and suggested God arranges everything for the best. Socrates was considered a moral and just philosopher. He proved it in the way he lived and the way he died. Plato. Plato lived between 424 and 348 BC. He was a classical Greek philosopher from Athens. Plato was a student of Socrates, Heraclitus, and Parmenides. Plato founded the Platonist school of thought and the Academy, which was the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. Plato was credited with being one of the founders of spirituality in Western religion through a chain of Neoplatonic thinkers. Plato created the written forms of dialogues and dialectics. Plato was the son of Ariston and Perictione. He had a sister, Protone, and two brothers, Adamantus and Glaucon. Glaucon was Plato's older brother. Glaucon was the interlocutor in the allegory of the cave, but is best known as the main conversant with Socrates in the Republic. Plato invented the theory of forms, in which he puts forth the idea that abstract objects exist outside the human mind. Platonic realism or Platonic idealism, the world of concrete objects and an unchanged, unseen world of forms or abstract objects. Plato studied in Egypt, Italy, Sicily, and Cyrene. Plato invented Platonic love and Platonic solids. Plato believed in the immortality of the soul. In the Timaeus, he has Socrates locate parts of the soul. Here we have our first sophist, Protagoras. Protagoras lived between 490 and 420 BC. He was born in Abdera, Thrace. He was a pre-Socratic philosopher. He was a student of Democritus. Democritus noticed his geometry skills and took him on as a student. However, Protagoras was not a fan of mathematics. He was a friend of Pericles. He was dubbed as a sophist by Plato. Plato said Protagoras invented the role of being a professional sophist. Protagoras, in Plato's dialogue, is a self-admitted sophist and called it an honorable ancient art that even Homer and Hesiod practiced. It ends with Socrates winning by insisting that all virtue is knowledge and that it can be taught. Credited with the philosophy of relativism, based on his most famous quote, "Man is the measure of all things." This would suggest there is no absolute objective truth and that everything is relative to the individual. Aristotle said Protagoras was criticized for claiming to make the weaker argument stronger. In his On the Gods treatise, he wrote, "Concerning the gods, I have no means of knowing whether they exist or not, or what sort they may be. Many things prevent human knowledge, including the obscurity of the subject and the brevity of human life." He was a fan of agnosticism. Gorgias. Gorgias lived between 483 BC and 375 BC. He was a pre-Socratic philosopher, sophist, and rhetorician. He was from Sicily. He was a student of Empedocles. He was considered the father of sophistry. He was credited with the idea of paradoxical thought and expression. He also developed some rhetorical innovations involving structure. He developed and taught a distinctive style of speaking. He was good at speaking. There is a debate whether he was a nihilist, based on some scholars' interpretations of his work on non-existence, which is a lost original. First, that nothing exists. Second, that even if it exists, it is inapprehensible to humans. And third, that even if existence is apprehensible, it certainly cannot be communicated or interpreted to one's neighbors. His rhetorical works are an encomium of Helen, which is a defense of Helen of Troy, which for that time was kind of a crazy argument, defense of Palamedes, and Epitaphios. Plato named one of his dialogues Gorgias, based on a Socratic dialogue with sophists at a dinner party. Hippias. Hippias lived during the 5th century BC. He was a philosopher and a rhetorician. He had a wealth of knowledge, and he was a peer of Socrates. He would teach and lecture on grammar, history, mathematics, poetry, and politics. Plato thought he was arrogant, self-centered, and wrote the dialogues Hippias Major and Hippias Minor based on these qualities. He was credited with the concept of natural law, the idea that natural laws are objective and universal and independent of human understanding. Some suggested that his knowledge, while abundant, was superficial and lacked depth in subjects. Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus lived between 459 BC and 400 BC. He was from Chalcedon. His name translates to savage or fierce fighter. Most of his life was spent as a sophist in Athens. Plato noted him as a successful rhetorician in the Phaedrus. He was also a character in Plato's Republic and was portrayed as willing to say anything to defend his position. He also demanded payment before responding to Socrates. Aristophanes made reference to him as well. Plato's Sophists. Plato's definition of a sophist can be pieced together from his dialogues, where he critiques their methods and practices. He generally defines a sophist as a professional educator who teaches rhetoric, persuasion, and virtue for a fee, but whose knowledge is superficial or deceptive. The sophists are often portrayed as relativists who prioritize success and persuasion over truth. Their aim, in Plato's view, is not to pursue genuine wisdom, but to win arguments and manipulate public opinion, often with little concern for ethics or the deeper meaning of virtue. Plato sees sophists as the philosophical opposite of Socrates, who seeks truth, virtue through dialectic reasoning. Plato's key definitions and criticisms of sophists. teachers of persuasion, not knowledge. Sophists are skilled in the art of rhetoric, teaching others how to persuade, whether or not the argument is based on truth. In dialogues like Gorgias, Plato portrays sophists as using rhetoric to manipulate rather than to educate. Moral relativism. Many sophists, like Protagoras, hold the view that man is the measure of all things, suggesting that truth and morality are relative. Plato, however, believes in objective truth and regards sophists as undermining ethical standards by teaching that truth is whatever the individual or the masses decide it is. Monetizing knowledge. Sophists charge money for their teaching, while Plato contrasts with Socrates' pursuit of wisdom is done freely with no expectation of payment. In Protagoras is depicted as a wealthy and highly paid educator, while Socrates expresses skepticism about the integrity of those who profit from teaching virtue. Appearances over substance. Plato often criticizes sophists for focusing on appearances and superficial arguments rather than seeking true understanding. In Sophist, a dialogue dedicated to defining the nature of the sophist, they are depicted as imitators or deceivers who create illusions of wisdom but lack true knowledge. Here are some key examples from Plato's dialogues. Protagoras, which is an example of moral relativism and teacher virtue. Gorgias is a master of rhetoric and is indifferent to justice. Hippias has superficial knowledge across many subjects. Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus are eristic debaters who focus on verbal trickery. This is something we've discussed a ton before, especially on the Mindscape podcast, which is eristic or eristic rhetoric, which is arguing for the sake of arguing or arguing to win without the aim of objective truth. Thrasymachus has that cynical, power-driven worldview on justice. Callicles advocates for might over right and ethical relativism. Plato consistently critiques the sophists for what he views as their shallow understanding of virtue and their manipulation of rhetoric for personal gain, contrasting them with the Socratic pursuit of truth and moral integrity. From Plato's dialogue Protagoras, you have Protagoras versus Socrates. The premise is Socrates visits the house of Callias, where he meets Protagoras, a renowned sophist and a gathering of prominent Athenians. The interlocutors are Protagoras, Socrates, Hippias, Alcibiades, Critias, and Prodicus. The main themes of this dialogue are virtue and teachability, which the central question is whether virtue can be taught. Nature of virtue. Socrates and Protagoras explore if virtue is one unified concept or a collection of individual virtues. Role of the sophist. The dialogue examines the sophist's role as teacher of virtue and whether they truly impart knowledge. Outcome. Protagoras argues that virtue can be taught using myth and poetry to support his view. Socrates challenges him, suggesting that virtue might be knowledge and questioning whether it can be truly taught. The dialogue ends without a definitive answer, but Socrates demonstrates his method of questioning as superior to the sophistic method of argument. In Plato's dialogue Gorgias, you have Gorgias versus Socrates. The premise is Socrates visits Gorgias, a famous sophist, to discuss the nature of rhetoric, its purpose, and its moral implications. The interlocutors are Gorgias, Socrates, Polus, and Callicles. The main themes are rhetoric versus philosophy. Socrates explores whether rhetoric is an art that seeks truth or merely a means to persuade. Justice and power. The dialogue delves into the ethics of rhetoric and its impact on justice, as well as the distinction between true power and the mere appearance of power. Hedonism and virtue. Socrates debates with Callicles about whether the pursuit of pleasure is the highest good. Outcome. Gorgias concedes that rhetoric, as practiced by Sophists, can be used unethically. Socrates argues that rhetoric without a foundation in justice is harmful. He concludes that living a virtuous life, even if it leads to suffering, is superior to living unjustly. As I've mentioned before, I think Gorgias is actually the greatest of all Sophists because he takes it the furthest, and you can look into previous episodes for me discussing that. In Plato's dialogue, Hippias Major, you have Hippias versus Socrates. The premise is Socrates encounters Hippias, a sophist known for his broad knowledge, and they discuss the nature of beauty. The interlocutors are Hippias and Socrates. The main themes are the definition of beauty. Socrates questions Hippias on what makes something beautiful and whether beauty is subjective or objective. Knowledge and expertise. The dialogue explores whether someone like Hippias, who claims expertise in many fields, truly understands the essence of what he discusses. Outcome. Hippias provides several definitions of beauty, but Socrates refutes each one. The dialogue ends without a clear answer, exposing Hippias' lack of depth in understanding despite his reputation. In Plato's dialogue Hippias Minor, you have Hippias versus Socrates. The premise is Socrates and Hippias discuss the nature of wrongdoing and whether it's better to do wrong intentionally or unintentionally. Interlocutors are Hippias and Socrates. The main themes are intentional versus unintentional wrongdoing. Socrates poses the question of whether it's more blameworthy to do wrong on purpose or by accident. Virtue and knowledge. The discussion touches on whether knowledge can lead someone to do wrong intentionally, contrasting sophistic and Socratic views on virtue. Outcome. Hippias is baffled by Socrates' arguments, which seem paradoxical. Socrates suggests it's better to have knowledge of wrongdoing, even if it means intentionally committing it, than an act out of ignorance. The dialogue exposes the weakness in Hippias' thinking and highlights Socrates' method of questioning. In Plato's dialogue, Euthydemus, you have the brothers Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus basically squaring off with Socrates. The premise is Socrates meets the Sophists who demonstrate their heuristic skills by using tricky arguments. Again, heuristic is a form of rhetoric which is a debating style in which you are just debating to debate or arguing to argue to win without the aim of truth or without trying to arrive at some sort of objective truth. The interlocutors in this are Euthydemus, Dionysiodorus, Socrates, and a young man named Crito. The main themes, heuristic versus dialectic. Socrates contrasts the sophist's heuristic style with his dialectic method, which seeks truth, virtue, and wisdom. The dialogue addresses whether virtue and wisdom can be acquired through sophistic techniques. Fallacies and paradoxes. Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus use fallacies to confound Socrates and the others, exposing the emptiness of their approach. The outcome is Socrates demonstrates that the sophist's arguments, while clever, are logically flawed and do not lead to genuine knowledge. The dialogue illustrates the contrast between the sophist's manipulation of words and Socrates' sincere pursuit of the truth. Here are some of the specific examples of sophistry highlighted through Plato's dialogues. In Plato's Gorgias, you see rhetoric as a form of flattery. In Gorgias, Socrates debates with the sophist Gorgias, as well as his fiery student Polus and the ruthless Callicles. The core question here is rhetoric a true art or merely a form of flattery? Socrates argues that rhetoric, as practiced by sophists, is like pastry baking compared to true medicine. It pleases the audience without necessarily nourishing their minds. Callicles, in contrast, insists that might makes right, that power is the true currency of the world, and that laws are mere constructs of the weak to control the strong. What if Socrates is underestimating the practical value of rhetoric? Could there be a middle ground where persuasion serves the truth rather than distorting it? If Socrates had been more open to rhetorical techniques, could his message have reached a wider audience? In Protagoras, again, we learn, can virtue be taught? We see Socrates engage with Protagoras, one of the most famous sophists, on the nature of virtue. Protagoras claims that virtue can be taught and that he himself is capable of doing so. Socrates, ever the skeptic, pushes Protagoras into contradictions, exposing the weakness in his arguments. But here's the twist. Despite Plato's portrayals, Protagoras may have had a point. Modern cognitive science suggests that ethical behavior and critical thinking can indeed be cultivated through education. Was Socrates simply trying to dismantle his opponent rather than explore a synthesis of their ideas? If Protagoras was right, then the Sophists may not have been the charlatans after all. Could Plato's depiction of them may have been politically motivated, designed to elevate Socrates at their expense? In Plato's dialogue, The Republic, you have Thrasymachus and the definition of justice. Perhaps the most dramatic clash comes in The Republic, where Socrates takes on Thrasymachus, a sophist who claims that justice is merely the advantage of the stronger. This is one of the most cynical yet pragmatic takes on power dynamics. Socrates, as usual, refutes Thrasymachus by showing that rulers often make mistakes, meaning that if justice is whatever the ruler declares, then justice must sometimes be against the ruler's own interests, an apparent contradiction. But let's step back. Doesn't Thrasymachus' argument resonate today? Aren't laws often shaped by those in power to serve their own ends? While Socrates is right in his logical dismantling, he sidesteps the reality of the political manipulation. Would Socrates' idealistic vision of justice hold up in our modern world of lobbying, corporate interests, and state propaganda? While Socrates may have won the philosophical argument, Thrasymachus' perspective remains eerily relevant. Perhaps the real question is, how do we reconcile philosophical ideals with political realities? Final reflections. Who really won? So who came out on top? If we follow Plato's narrative, Socrates emerges as the champion of truth and intellectual integrity. But if we take a more critical approach, the Sophists were far from mere deceivers. They were pragmatic educators who understood the social realities of power and persuasion. The real lesson here is not to pick a side, but to integrate the best of both. What if we embrace Socratic questioning while also honing rhetorical skill? What if we sought truth, but also recognized the power of well-crafted persuasion? Perhaps this is the synthesis that modern philosophy and discourse need. That's it for this episode of Masters of Rhetoric. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive. Make sure you subscribe, leave a review, and share your thoughts. Do you think Socrates was right to attack the Sophists, or do they deserve a reevaluation? Join the conversation, and until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep trying to master rhetoric.